Our special guest for this episode is Kassia Wedekind. Kassia is a teacher, a math coach, a presenter, and an editor. She is also the author of 2 books, Math Exchanges and Hands Down Speak Out. We asked Kassia to join us to talk about planning.
Previously on Teaching Like Ted Lasso.
Sam Bennett really helped me to see, okay, Chris, you just can't plan day to day. You've got to plan for several weeks. What she helped me to see was if I know where I'm going, just like that Yogi Berra quote, if I know where I'm going, those detours that sometimes happen, if I've got a long-term plan, I can get back on course more easily.
I was actually just about to discuss her book, Hands Down, Speak Out, and that's for elementary teachers, but I think the lessons are very applicable to the secondary classroom. She actually has teachers document who's talking and the direction in which they're talking, and she provides this really lovely example of sort of a before and after the intervention. Before the intervention, it was just, what is it? All roads lead to Kevin or something like that, I think is the name of the section.
Welcome, I'm Dave.
I'm John.
And this is Teaching Like Ted Lasso. Warning, we expect that you have watched Ted Lasso. There will be spoilers ahead and scenes that don't make sense if you don't have some familiarity with the show. Teaching Like Ted Lasso is excited to welcome one of, can I say favorite guests? I guess we're at the end. No one else is going to be trying to do this. So, well, one of my favorite guests in terms of, I've been following Kassia's work for years, and she's really influenced the way that I teach my pre-service elementary. We've used math exchanges in the class for a long time as my students were planning lessons for small groups of elementary kids. I was just rewatching ShadowCon, where Kassia challenged us to be more joyful and playful. After one NCTM conference, I held a math party at her suggestion after something she did. So it's not a stretch to say that she's really influenced the way that I teach, and I'm so glad that she's here. With all that I've said, I still haven't done justice here, Kassia. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? What would you like them to know?
Well, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. I guess how I describe my work is that I was a classroom teacher for many years. I taught kindergarten and second grade and third grade and was a school-based math coach. And now I kind of split my time between editing professional books about math and other things, and still spending time in classrooms and in schools, often in math class. So I get to do a mixed bag of things. And I think those are my favorite days, that I get to be amongst students and teachers.
So are you familiar with Ted Lasso? We have to ask it, but you don't have to have seen anything to be able to be on the podcast. We're the ones who make the connections.
I would say I have a small amount of familiarity. Maybe that's risking getting kicked off the podcast here, but I have watched like a couple of episodes, so I feel like I know the general premise, but not a lot of details.
One of the things that happens on the show, I don't know if it was on any of the episodes that you got to see, but Ted tends to ask these oddball, off-the-wall questions to get to know people. So our question for this theme is, do you have a go-to karaoke song?
My only public karaoke experience was on a cruise ship, and my husband and I sang a duet of Total Eclipse of the Heart in
super nice.
fancy outfits, taking it super seriously. I don't know if it was enjoyed by the audience, but we had a good time.
Oh, that's excellent. And a story to go with it.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you were going to do it again, would you do the same one? It turned out well.
We've laughed about it a lot at the time and in the years since. So yes, I think I'd do it again.
It's what everybody expects from you at this point.
Exactly.
Kassia, one of the key books that really influenced a course that I was teaching early on was Math Exchanges. John and we were really interested in thinking about the connections between literacy and math teaching. And when we found your book, I'm like, oh, this is great. This is exactly what we've been looking for. So it wasn't a stretch for us to think when we were doing this particular theme on planning that we wanted to include you in this discussion. And in particular, as I was rereading it in preparation for this, I came across this list on page 24. You probably don't have it memorized at this point. So let me share with you the outcomes of the math workshop. And I'm going to read it just for our listeners. Outcomes of math workshop: students experience joyful rigor. Students see math as flexible and learn many strategies for approaching problems. Because choice is a critical part of math workshop, students take ownership over their learning, knowing that their conjectures, investigations, and strategies are the foundation of the workshop. Students view peers as valuable mathematical resources with whom they can collaborate and from whom they can learn. Students learn to engage in rich discussion of strategies and ideas and value the learning process over a single correct answer. Students see problem solving as a challenge. They persevere through difficulty and do not define themselves by failure if they do not reach a correct solution. Students learn to self-manage and self-monitor through independent and group work. They begin the process of taking responsibility for their own learning. And finally, the role of the teacher is expanded to that of facilitator and coach. This is 13 years old and it still stands up. So I guess in all of this, my question is maybe looking at a couple of those bullets, Kassia, how do teachers plan for that?
I was curious when you said you're going to put a piece up, thinking about like, ooh, would I still agree with something that I wrote more than a decade ago? I think I do for the most part. But I think that thinking a lot about the questions that we ask students or the tasks that we're asking them to work on is an important part of planning for these kinds of outcomes, because if I just give them like a worksheet of problems and skills and it's right or wrong and there's not a lot of space provided for discussion, then it's really hard to achieve those goals there. But if instead I'm focused on giving a problem that has something juicy to discuss, even if there is a correct answer to the problem, but if my focus as a teacher is on helping kids talk about their strategies and helping them think about whether their strategies are the same or different, or why things work, or if things always work, if I can kind of like make that the focus rather than just the little skills underneath that, then that feels like I'm going to get a lot closer to those outcomes than if I'm just focused on small little skills. I think that often math class has tended to focus on like an accumulation of lots of little skills. And those skills are important, but if we're just like dealing with them all separately instead of trying to like put them together or think about why they work, then there's not a lot of space for discussion or for figuring things out together. And I don't think you're going to get a lot of the things from that list from just practicing rote skills.
Yeah, that's so cool. It reminds me, one of our earlier guests was Chris Devani. So she was talking again about that same idea of, rather than addressing just individual skills, and obviously she was talking in English language arts, that we needed a longer vision of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And planning involved not just thinking about what am I going to do today, but how does what we're doing today build into these larger purposes?
Yeah, I think that can be really easy to forget in the day-to-day when I'm looking at the list of standards that I have to teach, which are like always too many than you have time for. Thinking about perhaps how my students are going to be assessed and viewed by outside forces, or it can be easy to just focus on like what is written in the standard, that they're going to do this computation or know this fact or know what this is called in math. But that's a good way of thinking about it. Like if we can see like the longer goal of like, what is it that we hope for students as mathematical thinkers, and how can I get to like a little of that within these skills that I'm teaching, that we have a lot more chance of students viewing math as something like interesting to think about instead of just like an achievement to unlock or something you know or don't know. And I think that goes to the idea that if you don't get a skill right away, some students will see that as like a failure of themselves. Like, I must be not good at math, or I must be dumb because I don't know this one thing, as opposed to seeing this as like, oh, this is just a part of the figuring out and the problem solving, that everyone's gonna get to points where they don't know something or something's not making sense. And I guess I'm hoping for the latter with students that I teach, that they see that as like, yeah, everybody gets to points when they're like, this does not make sense. This is totally wrong. I don't know what's happening here. Like, that is part of doing math.
Yeah, if you're problem solving, you've got to not know what to do.
Jeff Crawl was talking about these portfolios that high school students are looking at and sort of seeing their progress.
Yeah.
And so how do we help teachers to, again, plan for those opportunities to highlight students' growth?
Something that I did as a classroom teacher that I really enjoyed, and I think my students got a lot out of, is when we're solving problems, oftentimes in small group, but sometimes in whole group, we just kept all of those problems, like just regular story problems, in a notebook for the whole year. These 3-ring binders, they would add them to them, each problem to them. And then sometimes I would have them like flip back to an earlier problem, like months earlier, maybe the same problem type, maybe something different, and say like, what do you notice about what you were doing in October now that we're in March? That's all I had to say. They were so good at finding ways that they had grown or changed, or things that are different about their strategies, or something that they didn't know back then that now they do. And it was such a point of pride and important reflection for them, because sometimes that's hard to see in the day-to-day of how you're learning. But if you go back a few months, kids can see how they're progressing and changing, and what things used to be difficult aren't as difficult anymore, or things that they know about now they didn't even know the name for back then. So that was just like one simple move that had a lot of power as far as like reflection and helping kids understand just the process of learning something.
Yeah, one of my favorite reflection questions now is, I used to think, but now I think.
Mm-hmm.
And just with pre-service teachers, you get just some heartfelt, honest recognition of their shift.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like just an important question for life. Like, I feel like I could answer that in all sorts of domains in my life, whether we're talking about between now and 10 years ago, or now and last week. In some cases, just the idea that like, we're always working at these things. And that's kind of what I want kids to know about math, like regardless of like how they use math in the future. Like, it's one of those things that we're just like always working on in life. There's not really a particular destination always. Like, it's just a way of thinking that we can always just keep working at, keep thinking about differently.
Are there any other connections you see between kind of thinking about that workshop model and math exchanges and planning?
Something important about workshop, and I think this is true in reading and writing workshop as well, at least in my experiences of it, is that you might be planning with standards in mind, or a goal in mind, or curriculum in mind, but above all else, like, you're planning for the students in front of you in mind, and their identities as readers and writers and mathematicians, and you're always keeping at the front of your mind, how are they going to think about this problem? How are they going to approach this? What strategies might they have? What's going to be important to them? And that stands at least side by side with the other kind of goals, or the other documents or things that we use for planning, is the students themselves. And I think that often gets lost when we're thinking about curriculum that we're buying that doesn't know the students. Even good curriculum doesn't know the students in front of you. So it's the teacher who's going to bring that to the forefront in their planning. No curriculum can listen to our students the way that teachers can. So that feels like this like sacred responsibility of the teachers to like bring the students into the planning alongside the standards, alongside the curriculum, alongside the skills, and bring their strengths into the planning as well, and thinking about like all the great things that they will bring to a problem that they know, things they're almost doing, as well as things that are challenging or they're not yet doing or knowing yet.
That's just so nice. And so many connections with, I was just talking with Dave and his wife Kathy. They've got their book Designing Math Adventures about to release. And their one sentence lesson plan, but kind of both these themes you were talking about, that big important why, and then the focus on a single student. Dave, do you want to say anything about that or connections you're hearing?
As Kassia said, even good curriculum, even a curriculum that I want to use, that I want
Mm-hmm.
the teachers that I work with to have access to. Research based does not mean the research was done on the students that are in front of me. It can inform, again, if we're thinking about from a design perspective, it can give us ideas. But when it comes down to the details and what's going to go on in my class, it's going to really depend on what I know about my students. Kathy tells a story in the book about teaching a group of first graders, and they were decomposing 5.
Mm-hmm.
And the story problem in the book was about sheep. Well, she had, I think it was like 17 boys and 6 girls, and the boys were not interested in sheep. And so it was just a simple matter then of thinking about what were the children interested in that could help them to engage in the problem. And it was race cars.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did race cars about how many were crossed and how many weren't. And if it hadn't worked, she also had a list of other things with dinosaurs and things like that could have worked. And that's a small little thing, but I think about what Deborah Ball talks about discretionary space, and I guess that was one of the big things where Kathy and I wanted to share what our experience has been, because we were hearing way too many teachers talking about their experience in classrooms where they were expected to read a script. The principle would be, if I'm walking down the 3rd grade hall, I want to hear everybody saying the exact same thing. And I think that's educational malpractice, because just as Kassia was saying, it ignores like the most important people in the classroom, and that's the kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, those kids never learn their lines.
Yeah, I think that point about the things that only teachers can bring forward to the planning, even alongside good curriculum, is really well said. And sometimes, like you described that as a small move, and it is a small move, but it's also like any teacher can tell you like the difference between some kids who are engaged in a problem and kids who don't care about the sheep problem is going to have a big impact. So I think those small shifts even are not actually small in their impact.
So another small shift that I recall you doing, and this is now the problem with me having listened and watched and read so much, was the numberless problems. I can't remember if that was in Math Exchanges or something that you did afterwards, but that also seemed like a very small shift that got back to the idea of thinking about big ideas and not simply the answer. Do you want to say a little bit about those numberless problems?
Yeah, I think that's a good example of kind of a small move, just taking out the numbers when you first start thinking about a story problem with a group or the whole class, because it really does something to the power dynamics. If I put up a story problem for my whole class or even for a small group, there are some kids that are not listening to anything else. They're like, okay, I know my job here. My job is to start computing and like get in there with an answer fast and wave my hand around or yell it out, and then other kids who are still thinking about it are frustrated that they don't have the time to think about it. There's a lot going on when we have the numbers there right away. And just by taking the numbers out, then we can open up a broader discussion where more people perhaps are accessing the discussion to think about like what's happening here in the problem. What do we know? What do we not know? What do you think? Do you think the answer is going to be, like, is something getting bigger, something getting smaller? What do you anticipate with these numbers? And the conversation is just more rich. And then students can go off on their own with the numbers, or choose numbers themselves, or choose from a different sets of numbers. Lots of different options there, but pausing the computation part for a moment to have a discussion has been a really powerful move I've found, especially since oftentimes certainly in a whole class setting, but even in small groups, I like to bring kids together with different kinds of strengths. So I'm not just grouping by kind of achievement level of skill. So making sure that I'm asking questions that kids with different strengths can have access to is really important, because if I'm not doing that, then why am I bringing that group together? Like, it's just going to enforce the status quo about who knows something and who doesn't.
One of our colleagues, Joy Osland, has been teaching us about complex instruction and that idea that you're either reinforcing the status quo or you're interrupting.
I like that way of putting it.
Interesting. Well, that might lead into Hands Down, Speak Out with Christy. Could you just describe for the audience what's the idea behind that book?
Hands Down, Speak Out came out of Christy and I's journey as teachers. We kind of grew up together as classroom teachers. We became coaches in similar time periods, but she became a literacy coach and I became a math coach. But we still talked a lot about the same students that we were working with, and found kind of similarities just in sharing social stories about the students that we love together, but also in thinking about discussion with students, discussions that we're facilitating with students about books and about writing, and then discussions about math, and thinking about like, how can we harness the power of discussion in classrooms, especially in elementary school classrooms where it's often the same teacher teaching all those subject areas. How can we kind of harness the power of talk and help students grow as talkers and listeners across the content areas?
But if students aren't raising their hands, how do you know who's going to talk?
Well, we always say that there's lots of tools for talk, and that one tool for talk is a conversation where you're raising hands, and that there's plenty of good situations where you would want to have hands as a tool, but it's just one tool for talk. Another one that a lot of folks are familiar with is the turn and talk, where you're asking two students to talk together, and we can all think about what advantages and challenges a conversation with just two people brings. And then one that we focus on in the book is gathering all students together for a whole class conversation and teaching into the idea that we can talk with each other and not just through the teacher, which is often what happens when hand raising starts to happen. It's all directed at the teacher, and she's kind of moderating and deciding what questions to ask and deciding whose points to follow up on and who's not to. And so when we have a hands down conversation, we're giving some of that responsibility over to the students and saying, like, we can actually just talk to each other and respond to each other's ideas and ask each other's questions without always having to raise our hands. And of course, that doesn't happen magically the first time you have a hands down conversation. Just like anything you do the first time isn't like, oh, that was perfect, no need to do any more work on that. So we talk a lot in the book about how you can help students grow in their talk skills when they're talking directly, and listening skills when they're talking and listening directly to one another. And that the teacher, it's not as if the teacher has no role just because they're not moderating hand raising. It's just that their role has shifted. And that we can use hands down conversation as one talk tool amongst like a whole toolbox of tools that we're using for facilitating conversations.
And one of the striking things in there is that you talk about kind of the informal assessment of just tracking not just who's talking and who's not, but kind of the direction of the conversations. Say you get an opportunity to do that, how does that then lead into planning? Like, what's your response as a teacher to once you've got that kind of data?
Yeah, so when I'm looking at data, maybe from a hands-down conversation about, and I've tracked like who was talking and how often and that sort of thing. And maybe I've also kind of jotted down what sorts of things people were saying. I'm thinking about it through a couple of different lenses. One is like, I'm thinking, if it was a math conversation, I'm thinking about the content of their math ideas and what their understandings are and what might be next steps there. But I'm also thinking about what kinds of talk and listening moves are they already doing? Like, maybe I notice that they're adding on to each other's ideas, but maybe I notice one person starting to revise their ideas, and I think like, ooh, like that might be a space to lean into and talk about how when you hear someone else's idea, that can sometimes make you change your mind or make you think differently about something. So I'm kind of like thinking about the conversation with those two lenses of talk and the math content. And some of that is around participation, but not always. So sometimes I might see that especially at the beginning of this work, sometimes it might be dominated by just like a few voices and other people not having so much opportunity to talk. So then we might do some teaching into like how our goal in a hands-on conversation is that if we were to map it out, that it kind of looks like a spider web of the conversation, like bouncing around to many different sides of the circle or of the talking group. And sometimes just by shifting that goal, people start inviting other people in more. They kind of like take a pause before contributing yet another thought to a conversation. Like it shifts the goal, because I think a lot of students and adults think that their role in a conversation to do well is to say their idea and to kind of perform their knowledge instead of like listening sometimes. So sometimes it's just like reorienting the goal there.
I'm pretty sure this was your expression, but just that who's talking, who's not, and why.
Yeah, it can definitely reveal some really interesting patterns that sometimes we don't notice as teachers in the moment because there's so much to pay attention to in the moment. So having some little pieces of data that we can reflect on when we're not in the moment is helpful to think about, like if there's some voices that are not getting into the conversation, are there some ways that we can show that we value those voices or help those students if they want to get into the conversation? So sometimes that might be asking a student to start the conversation. Like, you had this really important idea when we were out working on this task. Would you say what you were thinking there as a way to start? Sometimes that helps someone who might be having a harder time like getting their voice into the middle of a conversation if they can be the starting voice. And also the teacher using their position to value that voice. Like, this person has an important idea, go ahead. And we don't want to force people to participate in the whole class conversation. We'd rather create opportunities where they feel like their voice is valued or needed, knowing that like participation is never exactly equal in a whole class conversation. And that's just one venue where students have opportunities to talk, that students often participate differently across different talk contexts.
So Jeff brought up the story. Is it all roads go through Kevin?
Yeah. So one thing we sometimes do, especially when we're first starting out with a hands-on conversation, is to make a conversation map where we're writing, we often sit in a circle and where we write everybody's name around the circle and we're drawing a line from who's speaking to who's speaking to kind of look at that piece of data. And we had this one example conversation from a 5th grade class. And like after every comment, it seemed to bounce back to Kevin. So there were all these lines of conversation going into Kevin. And that was not a surprise, of course, for the teacher, that she knew that like Kevin was very charismatic and he had a lot of social power and status in that class. And kids were very interested in what Kevin thought of their ideas. So Kevin did a lot of the talking. So we can think about like, if we want to provide opportunities for other kinds of talkers and listeners to contribute to this conversation, how might we do that without totally squashing Kevin's enthusiasm too? Because in this case, Kevin was a great kid and had lots to say and was eager to contribute, but we also wanted to hear from other people too.
Yeah, I've been struggling with that this year, right? So I've got a student like that.
Yeah, I often sometimes think when I'm in a meeting of adults, what would it look like if I drew a conversation map of this conversation? So even as adults, when we think of ourselves as more sophisticated talkers and listeners, have not always learned the skill of sharing the space. And that's probably because those people have learned something. They've learned that they've gotten like positive reinforcement often for being someone that contributes a lot of ideas, says an idea first. We certainly, I think, as a society, value that a lot more than someone who does more listening. So they've gotten a lot of feedback that is a helpful thing or a good thing. So they might not be so inclined to share the space, or they haven't thought a lot about like, what are some different ways I can make sure that other people's voices are amplified or made space for in this conversation.
Like I said, I just got done rewatching your ShadowCon presentation, and maybe they didn't play enough, right? They can't deal with those social cues because they haven't had those opportunities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So they don't know when the bear is happy or angry. We'll put a link.
We are.
Audience, we'll put a link so that you all can enjoy that as well.
Yeah, certainly in play, we're learning lots about the back and forth required to engage in play with someone else. If we're truly engaging with someone else, that requires back and forth instead of just unilateral direction.
So Kassia, you've been extremely generous with your time. We appreciate you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience about planning that we haven't talked about? Is there anything more that we can look forward to from you that we should know about? This is your space. I'm taking the cue. It's all yours.
I guess I never like to miss an opportunity to just share appreciation for all the teachers that I know and don't know that are out there doing the work of planning, the hard work of planning day in and day out, and dealing with the nuances that I think that of planning that I think only teachers know, of all the many variables that impact planning, from the more instructional decisions to the, but I have this weird 10-minute space between lunch and recess sort of thing. It's just hard and important work that gets undervalued, not by anyone here or the listeners to this, but I just really appreciate the planning that teachers do that often is unseen by other folks.
Yeah, there was I just saw yesterday, it came in the ASCD educational leadership that was talking about it's all about emotional learning, and it's focusing on teachers' emotional learning and how overwhelmed they feel with all that they have to do. So much of that is because, just as you were saying, Kassia, we don't provide enough time for teachers to play. Compared to other countries around the world, we just don't give them that chance. So I appreciate you lifting that up.
Thank
Don,
you for having me.
Don, any final thoughts?
Trilogies are kind of natural things. Is there something you've been thinking about?
I'm always thinking about ideas, but it's so much easier to come up with an idea than to actually write anything down on the page. And what seems like a brilliant idea sometimes isn't when you get it down on the page. No, I think I'm lucky to spend a lot of time now editing the work of other teacher authors, and that's really just a joy to get to help educator writers get their voices out in the world. Like, we have so many voices telling teachers what to do, from policymakers and lawmakers to curriculum makers to test makers. It's such an honor to get to help amplify teacher and educators' words and make space for their work. So I'm so happy to do that as part of my work.
That's great. Do you have an author with something coming out soon that you're excited to see out?
Oh my goodness, I can't name one because that would be like naming favorite children.
Gotcha.
They're
That
all
makes
my
sense.
favorite.
Well, we've shared with others, and we'll just remind them and you here that if any of those authors ever want to come on, get a hold of us at teachinglikeTedLasso@gmail.com.
Yeah, that would be great. I really, when I was looking and listening back to some of your previous episodes, I was struck by like how many different areas, and like both from like different content areas or different grade levels or people in different kinds of roles. And I just love that take on like different perspectives, but always something to say around a common topic. So yeah, that's great work.
People have been so generous with us.
We have learned so much.
I bet.
So thank you. We appreciate you.
Yes, thank you. Likewise.
Can't wait to see what comes next.
From you all too.
All righty. Thank you.
Bye.
Please check out our show notes for more resources. John, I don't think you ever answered the question. What was your answer to karaoke?
I know it's terrible asking people a question that you haven't thought, especially now at this point. I've asked a couple people this question. So it's like different depending on what I've listened to that morning.
So what'd you listen to this morning?
I have kind of a punk playlist I was listening to this morning while I was cleaning. So I'll go Pump It Up from Elvis Costello.
Ooh, nice.
Nice.